Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are discussing quad-core processors, namely how relevant they are in 2019. Now, the last time I covered this topic was back in 2017, and recently quite a few of you have been referring to that video, asking me if I can revisit this subject and create an updated 2019 version. The 2017 version was purely a discussion piece. There were no new benchmarks at the time, as I'd pretty much done all the testing that was necessary to discuss whether quad cores were worth it in 2017. Recently though, the channel focus has mostly been on GPUs, and I suppose understandably so with the release of Nvidia's RTX series, the RX 590, Radeon 7, and the newly released GeForce GTX 1660 Ti. The quad-core CPU discussion, in my opinion, is far less relevant than it was back in 2017 for the simple fact that there's no longer a top-tier CPU that only features 4 cores. The most expensive quad-core sold today is the Core i3-8350K, and we wrote that thing off the day it was released. Today it's priced just over $200, and you'd be bonkers to spend much over $100 on it. Then from AMD we have the Ryzen 3 1300X, which you can also ignore due to pricing. The R3 1200 is far more sensible at $90, though we suggest budget shoppers look at the R3 2200G, which is currently just $5 to $10 more, and offers a decent integrated graphics solution. Those of you shopping for a budget Intel CPU should be looking at the Core i3 8100, but at $125 US, my opinion is that the Ryzen 3 2200G is a far better value option. Anyway, the point of this video is to explore if these budget quad-core CPUs are worth buying today for gamers, or are they dead on arrival? I was going to explore how the Core i5 7600K is faring in 2019, but once I started getting into that testing, I felt like it was probably going to deserve its own video, as there was just a whole lot more I had to do. I really had to test the Ryzen 5 1600 as well. It wasn't really worth just including the 7600K, so perhaps in the near future I can do an updated Core i5 7600K versus Ryzen 5 1600 comparison. Let me know down in the comment section below if that's something you want to see happen. Anyway, quickly, while touching on the 7600K, back in 2017 I said the following: as much as I like the Ryzen CPUs, the 7600K is arguably better right now for the vast majority of gamers out there. You can certainly find titles where the Ryzen 5 1600 is faster and will no doubt end up being the superior CPU down the track, but most DirectX 11 titles play better with the higher clocked quad-core. Having said that, I wouldn't buy the 7600K. I'd get the Ryzen 5 1600, which is not only cheaper, but also supports overclocking on more affordable motherboards, and it ships with a decent cooler. So just to make it clear to all the AMD fans out there, back in 2017, we weren't recommending the 7600K, but I also didn't agree with the claim that quad-core CPUs were dead, like some people were claiming at the time. What does quad cores are dead even mean? To me, it means new games either A, refuse to load when attempting to run with a 4-core CPU, or B, run so poorly that the game's simply not playable. Thus far, the first point hasn't yet happened. All games that I'm aware of will execute and run on a quad-core processor. As for the second point, it's still quite rare to find a title that's unplayable on a quad-core. It might not be the best experience going around, but it's always very playable. Granted, you certainly wouldn't want to be paying mid-range or higher-end money for a 4-core CPU, but as an entry-level gaming option in 2019, I believe they're still perfectly fine. For this video, I'm going to explore CPU scaling performance using AMD Zen-based processors. I've got a few games to go over, and then I'd like to take a closer look at a few different configurations using Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Please note the GPU used for each test is labelled on the graph, as are the resolution and quality settings. The Ryzen processors were tested with DDR4 3200CL14 memory, while the Athlon 200GE uses DDR4 2400 CL14 memory. Starting with Rainbow Six Siege, we have the Ryzen 3 2200G representing the 4-core, 4-threaded CPUs, and we see a few interesting things here. Firstly, at 1080p, for those seeking big frame rates, the quad-core is still very punchy in this title, allowing for 183 FPS on average, with over 129 FPS at all times. That said, a dual-core processor with SMT enabled also allowed for very playable performance. Still, whereas we saw the 2200G trailing the 2700X by a 28% margin at 1080p, that figure is reduced to just 13% at 1440p and then 9% at 4K. In fact, even the Athlon 200G is able to deliver a similar gaming experience at 4K. That said, this won't be the case for all games. For example, let's take a look at Project Cars 2. Testing with Project Cars 2 showed pretty consistent performance gains as we increased the core count. Again, the quad-core Ryzen 3 2200G still enabled playable performance at 1080p, never dipping below 60 FPS, but when using a high-end GPU, it is clearly creating a system bottleneck. We see basically the same scaling at 1440p as well, and it's not until we hit 4K that the RTX 2080 Ti becomes the limiting component for most of these configurations. In fact, at 4K, it's only the dual-core Athlon 200G that can't keep up. For testing with Hitman, I've used the DirectX 12 API and have selected an NPC heavy scene. This basically crushed the dual-core processor to the point where it was unplayable, effectively killing it in this title. Then we have the quad-core 2200G, and it's right on the edge with a 1% low of 33 FPS. However, we do see a 70% variance between the 1% low and average frame rate with the 2200G, whereas the 2400G, which supports SMT, only saw a 31% variance. What this suggests is that the 2200G wasn't as smooth, and this is certainly what I saw when testing. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is another CPU demanding title, and here we see with the dual-core Athlon 200G, it really struggles to provide playable performance. The 2200G, on the other hand, while not ideal, it did provide playable performance, and we found at 4K that it was comparable to the 4-core 8-threaded 2400G, making it slightly slower than the Ryzen 5 2600. Now, I've deliberately included Forza Horizon 4 because, like a lot of games, it's not very CPU demanding. In fact, it plays perfectly fine on a modern dual-core processor, and we see that here when looking at the Athlon 200GE. Truth is, the vast majority of games aren't that CPU demanding, especially the popular esports titles. That said, it is extremely frustrating when gamers run into CPU-bound scenarios, which is why gamers talk about CPU performance so much. A super demanding new title is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and here we find the quad-core 2200G right on the edge. And again, the disparity between the 1% low and average frame rate is much greater than what we see with the 2400G. Even at the 4K resolution, the 2200G is massively limiting performance of the RTX 2080 Ti, and that suggests to me that this CPU will limit performance of much lower-end GPUs as well. So let's explore that now. Okay, so here we've changed up things quite a bit by adding the RTX 2060 and GTX 1060 6GB. Also, please note, while all GPUs have been tested using Tim's optimized graphics profile, the resolution does vary. For example, the 2080 Ti was tested at 4K, the RTX 2060 at 1440p, and then the 1060 6GB at 1080p. What's interesting to note here is that the Athlon 200G and Ryzen 3 2200G limited frame rates across the board. This is one of the reasons why we test CPUs with high-end GPUs, to remove the GPU as a potential system bottleneck. And while you might say pairing a 2200G with the 2080 Ti is unrealistic, it better informs you of the CPU's limits, and chances are with a lower-end GPU you'll still find those limits anyway with appropriately adjusted quality settings. Anyway, what we see here is that across the board, the Athlon 200G and Ryzen 3 2200G are limiting performance, and the same is also true for the 2400G. Finally, for an additional test, I took the GeForce GTX 1660 Ti and benchmarked it at 1440p using the lowest, medium, and highest quality presets. Again, just in the highly demanding Shadow of the Tomb Raider. The point of this test is to further illustrate just how difficult it is to cover this topic, even with multiple hardware configurations. Using the highest quality preset, the margin between the 2700X, 2600X, and 2400G is reasonably small. The 2200G does well for the average frame rate, but as we've seen numerous times already, lags behind for the 1% low result. This is of course seen again with the medium quality preset, and then is exaggerated even further with the lowest quality preset. We also find the limits of the 2400G here as well. So, even though we can increase the average frame rate performance of the GTX 1660 Ti by 48% with the 2200G by going from the highest to lowest quality preset, the 1% low performance, which is heavily CPU limited, is improved by just 27%. In the case of the 2600X and 2700X, we do see consistent scaling for both the 1% low and average frame rates, as we're not CPU bound for those configurations. So, are quad-core CPUs dead in 2019? Sounds like a simple question, but simply answering yes or no would be to oversimplify what is really a complex question. I think we can all agree that high-end or even mid-range quad-core CPUs, even those with SMT support, are dead. If not for the fact that neither AMD nor Intel has produced a quad-core processor, at least a mid-range or high-end one, for over a year now. but because they can limit performance in a number of modern titles, as we've just seen. Intel's current mid-range processors pack 6 cores with 6 threads, while AMD's pack 6 cores with 12 threads. This means 2017's quad-core Core i5 7600K, which was priced at $240 US, really is a thing of the past. And I think for today's market, $100 quad cores are perfectly fine, especially for those gaming with an RX 560, 570, a GTX 1050, right up to a 3GB 1060. A cheap quad core really will get you by there. That said, I'd suggest aiming for at least the $165 Ryzen 5 2600, but I can also completely understand that spending that extra cash isn't an option for everyone. Generally speaking, those buying $300 plus graphics cards aren't looking at pairing them with a $100 CPU. Of course, I don't doubt that sort of thing happens, but it's not the norm. Getting back to the Core i5 7600K for a moment, I realize that the quad-core performance shown in this video doesn't really reflect what the Intel 7th gen quad-core Kaby Lake part can deliver. We've seen in the past that the 7600K really does lay waste to the 2200G, but like I said, in its day it did cost twice as much, so there's probably no surprises there. But even so, in more modern titles such as Battlefield 5 multiplayer, the 7600K really will start to struggle there, though I suspect a heavy overclock with some decent memory will still be enough to get you out of trouble for now. I guess the point here is that not all quad cores are created equally. Some can be overclocked to around 5 GHz, offer high IPC and low latency. Others come at much more modest clock speeds, perhaps don't support the same memory bandwidths, latency, and so on. On that note, again, I am keen to pitch the Core i5 7600K against the Ryzen 5 1600 in a huge range of games to see which processor offers the best gaming experience in 2019, so keep an eye out for that content. Then finally we have the games themselves and then the quality settings used. If by chance you're mostly playing non-CPU intensive titles such as Forza Horizon 4, Ghost Recon Wildlands, Dirt 4, Fortnite, For Honor, what else? World of Tanks, probably newer games such as Metro Exodus, Dirt Rally 2.0, and even Apex Legends, they look as though, from my early testing, that a modern quad-core with a mid-range GPU will work just fine. However, if you're playing the Battlefield multiplayer games, Hitman, the Assassin's Creed series, or something like Shadow of the Tomb Raider for example, a mid-range to low-end quad-core CPU such as the Ryzen 3 2200G is really going to struggle. For the most part, these games will still be playable, the results will just be a little less than desirable. So, in short, quad cores are perfectly fine as entry-level parts, and thankfully today that's all they're being sold as. At the mid-range and beyond, I suppose they are dead, I suppose you could say that, and ideally you would want a 6-core 12-threaded CPU as a minimum, and it's probably going to be true for at least the next few years. Anyway, that is going to do it for this one. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and if you appreciate what we do at Unboxed, then consider supporting us on Patreon. Thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.